Social justice means applying the law equally to all people, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. I'm John Gonzalez. I'm here with my former law partner, Jack DeRora. We practice law, we seek social justice. On this show, we reveal the conflict between the two.
You know, for a while, it was just us in the office over a cup of coffee talking about the news of the day. With social justice issues dominating our culture, our focus became how do we, as lawyers, make a difference?
And now it's not just us. Today we have Jeff Wenninger, retired LAPD lieutenant and nationally recognized law enforcement expert, to talk about the reasonableness of police force. Jeff also wrote On Thin Ice, setting out his vision of reimagining policing. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
Our topic reminded me of a case, and probably 15 years ago, we were suing a trucking company and the truck driver for a really bad accident that killed our client.
Is this the one in Pickaway County?
In Pickaway County.
Right.
And the lawyer for the trucking company was a very, very good lawyer. And he got up to tell the jury on opening how this truck driver is just an ordinary guy. He gets up every day and he goes to work and he's paying the bills and taking care of his wife and family. And just a really nice discussion humanizing the truck driver and saying, you know, he didn't get up that morning with the thought that he was going to kill somebody. And I thought, wow, this was pretty effective. What they didn't know is our strategy already was to dismiss the truck driver and just go out there to trucking company. So after he was done, I stood up and said, Your Honor, we're going to dismiss Mr. Truck Driver from the case. And we basically talked to the jury about the problem isn't necessarily with the truck driver who made a mistake. It's with the training, the equipment, the supervising. So when we think about these police officers that use deadly force, it draws me back to that. I don't imagine that they get up in the morning thinking, I want to kill somebody today. I gotta imagine that's the last thing on their minds. And it's more of putting them in a position that it's going to happen because they don't either have the skills, the training, the psychological, ability to handle it. So I tend to give them a little bit more of a pass than you do, don't I?
You do, and I agree with you from my background, which is not law enforcement, but I do have a background in the military where standardization was critical in training and safety. And so when I see these bad shootings, I'm thinking, what in the world, how in the world were these men or women trained? Something is amiss. And yes, you and I disagree on how we should hold police officers accountable. We'll probably get into that.
Jeff, what is it? Is it the individual officer that we should be focused on, or is it the his or her bosses that we should be looking at?
Well, I don't believe necessarily that it's actually one or the other. It's a combination of the two. I've often said that there's a policy-practice divide. And what I mean by that is law enforcement has policies and procedures and tactical training standards that officers are trained to and have expectations to adhere to. That being said, there's a culture that oftentimes does not align with those policies and procedures. So those policies and procedures and tactical training practices are nothing more than words that are on paper if your culture does not align with that. And so therein lies the big problem. Unfortunately, and like Jack has said, there is no standardization nationwide relative to law enforcement training. I mean, even in the academy, there's differences from state to state in regards to how many hours somebody has to do in the police academy before they become a police officer out on the street, making tactical decisions and rapidly unfolding tactical scenarios. And the national average is about 800 hours. And to put that in context, to apply for your cosmetology license, you need 1,500 hours of training. So, really, there's a problem. And if we look worldwide, we look at the Nordic countries, they train for 2 and 3 years. They earn the equivalent of an undergraduate degree while also getting the police training that they get before they ever become a police officer and actually are selected. They're being monitored during that entire training to ensure that they are responding to the training and actually possess the characteristics that research would show is indicative of someone that will be a successful police officer who can make informed decisions under stress and use good judgment and use some intellectual intelligence relative to decisions that are being made. And there may be something that we can learn in American policing from outside this country.
How do you go about what I'm going to call game day training? I mean, I got to imagine that you can talk about the stress, and it's hard for me to imagine what law enforcement goes through in military. When you're there with a gun and people are being hostile to you and threatening, and I can see it escalating, but how do you train a police officer to deal with that type of situation?
Well, it really is about self-awareness of the situation and the potential threats, but also the impact that your actions will have on the incident, whether it's to escalate or de-escalate the incident. And you need to be conscious of all of that. And ultimately, determine what is your function, what is your role in any particular call or instance that you're dealing with, and act accordingly. And you have to understand the law. You have to understand that your force has to be commensurate with the severity of the crime, the threat that's actually posed to you, and look at what other alternatives you have other than using force. And it's that type of a mindset that needs to probably be more ingrained in our training than traditionally where we're hyper-vigilantly going to our use of force to resolve an incident rather than other means of accomplishing the same goal.
You've said a bunch of things that catch my attention, but two of them are policy practice divide and culture. Talk more about those two things.
Well, we train law enforcement officers with a curriculum and an expectation that it will impact their behavior. But do we even assess and evaluate, does that training accomplish what it is we're trying to accomplish? All too often, it's just to check the box so the organization can say they've done their due diligence and have trained the person in this particular area. But are they, in fact, competent or even understand what it is they're being asked to know in regards to the training? And it can be training relative to your understanding of the law. When you talk about a lot of stuff, I would argue that many officers, they couldn't even tell you that it's Graham versus Connor. That's the standard they're going to be evaluated by in their use of force, and that's a Fourth Amendment issue. Vast majority of police officers don't even understand that. In my experience in expert testimony in court, oftentimes cases are lost about 85% of the time with the officer's deposition because they're incapable of articulating their justification for using force. And it goes back to what John's talking about. What are these organizations doing that they work for where they are not aware of these things? These are the tools of your trade. You need to be on the top of your game and be able to articulate this stuff in your sleep. Because when you are in that tactically challenging situation where things are rapidly unfolding, you need to be able to make sound judgment calls and decisions under stress. And if you haven't been trained and thoroughly understand things and gone through it in your head prior to facing that incident, you're going to have a more difficult time in having an optimal outcome.
In other words, training has to result in almost instinctual reaction as opposed to just the fight or flight syndrome that takes hold when you're in a confrontation.
Right. And it's not just training. I mean, look at law enforcement. When you go through the academy, when you graduate, you have a standard that you have to meet relative to your physical fitness standards. Vast majority of law enforcement agencies, they have absolutely no standards beyond that. You can go your entire career without one physical fitness standard or evaluation. And that's important because our bodies and our ability to perceive environment is directly related to your physical fitness and your heart rate and your ability to maintain your composure under stress. And we drop the ball there as well.
I often wonder about, when we talk about training or the policies, like if there's a hard stop, and I'll give you an example I'm talking about. We're seeing people that are in a vehicle that are driving away and being shot. And you always hear that you can't outrun the radio, right? So, the police can radio ahead and they can pull the car over later. And you wonder why there just isn't a policy that if it's this type of a crime, let them go, we'll get them some other time, as opposed to actually pulling out your gun and stopping them. And I'm not talking about whether the police officer is in fear at some point during that scenario because of the way the car's, set up or accelerating. Just before you ever get there, is there a hard stop in the training that says, yeah, this is not worth what you're trying to do here, let them go? Or do police like, no way, they're leaving the scene here?
Well, the training is there. Their vast majority of police agencies and best practices here in the United States is that you do not place yourself in front or behind a vehicle. And why? Because that vehicle can perhaps be used against you, and it could escalate the situation where you may have to use deadly force. So knowing that, you don't place yourself in that position. And there's a lot of court cases that have set precedents relative to that, where officers are found to be culpable in their decision to use lethal force in the circumstance and where they created the circumstance themselves by in front of the vehicle. And it's underscored in your training. When you have that training, part of the reasonableness is not just the moment of threat, which many courts have kind of narrowed it down to. And there's Barnes versus Felix was a case in the Supreme Court just this past summer or spring, where they just reasserted the fact that it's the totality of the circumstances. You have to consider everything that the officer has done leading up to the decision to use lethal force relative to the ultimate reasonableness of the entire incident. So we still need to get back to that standard, where if you have an officer that's knowingly violating their tactical training and department's policies and procedures by placing them in front of a vehicle, how then reasonable are the actions of doing that? And then how did that unreasonable action then influence the necessity to use lethal force? And the courts have spoken in pretty much all of the circuit courts relative to this. And but the courts generally tend to look at just the moment of threat. But even then, you have to look at the reasonableness of the threat at that moment. And what you're really looking at are three things. First is ability. So when you're talking about somebody in a vehicle, when you have somebody behind the wheel in a vehicle, do they have the ability to cause you serious bodily injury or death? Yes, you can check the box, of course. Do they have the opportunity? Well, if you're an officer and you place yourself in front of that vehicle, they have the opportunity because you're right in front of them, and they could then use that vehicle, and we can check that box. Now it's about the intent. Is it reasonable to believe that the person actually has the intent to cause you serious bodily injury or death? And in many of these circumstances, and we've seen whether it was in this Blendon Township shooting or the shooting here with the ICE officer in Minneapolis, where in both circumstances, it's captured on video that the driver is turning the wheel in the opposite direction of the person. So did the officers see that? I don't know. But if they did, what would a reasonable officer interpret that to mean? And it could be suggested that it would mean that they're intending on fleeing, not running you over. So you have to be considering the severity of the crime. You have a misdemeanor crime. You have somebody that is objectively, you could believe, is trying to flee, not to cause you serious bodily injury or death. And ultimately, what other alternatives do I have? Do I have the ability to get out of the way? So those are the types of things that we need to be evaluating when we're a police organization training our officers to ensure that that's the way they're thinking through these processes and that it doesn't become a contempt of cop situation.
Well, that's where I was going with that, Jeff. And just from your experience as a police officer, not your more recent experience as an expert, is there something in the cops' mentality that is like, I gave you an order and you're not following it anymore, and it's not about I'm in fear is the reason I'm doing this. It's more I'm apprehending you because you're trying to resist that. And I hate to put it that way, but I could see that mentality breaking through. And then in the aftermath of that, you say, oh, I was in fear for my life.
I want to add to that ever so subtly, but important. Is it really a matter of I am allowed to control the situation and you are not allowed to disobey me, no matter how minor the offense is that we're talking about? And if I have to, I'll tie it into the shooting of Takaya Young.
Well, I can't speak to each individual officer's mindset because I'm not in their mind.
Right. But hold on for a second. But I'm talking about the culture.
Well, culturally, you do see that a belief that I'm giving a legal direction and order. The citizen has an obligation to comply with that. And when they don't, it really depends on the particular makeup of the officer relative to how they proceed from there. Mm-hmm. And that's where the breakdown is, because that requires good judgment. You can't take these things personally, because we are not paid as police officers to do what we do on a daily basis. We're paid for those judgment calls that we have to make when somebody isn't compliant.
But doesn't
it's not about being a police officer when people are being compliant. It's about being a police officer when they're not compliant, when they're aggressive, when they're assaultive, when they're combative. How do you respond to that? And is it in a measured and appropriate and lawful manner? Well, and that's what we kind of break down as well. And I'm going to expand on this a little bit because I think it's really important that just because it's legal doesn't mean that the organization should be supporting that. We need to ensure that the law enforcement agency is creating a buffer to do what? To protect the officer. Protect the officer from, if you violate policy, well, then guess what? You've now violated potentially the law. We don't ever want to see a police officer in court as a criminal defendant. We don't ever want to see that. So we as organizations need to hold our people accountable and hold standards that keep them far from that threshold of a criminal culpability or even civil liability. And unfortunately, we see organizations just jump to the defense of their officers, and that's sending the wrong message. And if you think that you can celebrate and say that it's appropriate, that everything was fine because they were found not guilty, you're mistaken. I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, that's the threshold you don't ever want to get to. And you need to have your policies and procedures and hold people accountable all the time. Now, the challenge here is, in these circumstances, when these incidents end in a tragic circumstance, which I don't believe for a second these officers or federal agents or whoever's involved in these cases intend or want to end this way. But unfortunately that they do. And we can't send the message that this is good policing.
But don't
And
these...
we need to acknowledge.
But doesn't this all go back to what you're talking about, judgment in difficult situations? So let's go back to the Takaya Young situation, because I think it's good to put my concern in context. Woman walks out of Kroger. She's got, 2 or 3 bottles of booze. Somebody alerts the police. She gets in the car. Connor Grubb gets there, steps in front of the car. The woman accelerates. There's a question. Was she trying to get away? Was she trying to run him over? I don't even want to get to whether it was a lawful shooting. My concern is all the activity to stop her by putting yourself in the car. So now the question is there a mentality that says once she disobeys, you are entitled to do whatever it takes, as opposed to we'll go get her another day in a calmer situation? And doesn't all that come back to culture and training, or in this case, a lack of training?
Well, it does. It all goes back to the culture and the training. And how does that training impact the actual decisions that are made in real life scenarios and situations? And it requires that you hold people accountable, not when things go tragically wrong, but anytime that you become aware as an organization that somebody has violated tactical practices or policies and procedures, you have to hold them accountable.
So make me feel good. Is there a culture that says, hey, damn it, somebody doesn't listen to you, you can do whatever it takes to command obedience? Is that the underlying message in most police departments?
I would say that there is a segment of society, not just in police departments, that feel that way.
Okay.
And I say that based on the feedback that you see people provide and the comments that they make relative to these discussions, when they say, if she just would have listened.
Right.
And that just irritates me. Because when you take an oath as a police officer, you are taking an oath to serve and protect. And with that comes a great deal of authority. And with that authority comes responsibility. And if you're going to hold that responsibility, then you have to be willing to be held accountable. And you need to adhere to the policies and procedures and the tactical training of your organization, and not fall victim to this mindset of justification and blaming the victim, so to speak. Because yes, of course, had she complied, this whole thing could have been avoided. But it's not her that I'm holding responsible. It's you as a police officer who, when you take that oath, is being held to a higher standard than anybody. Because you have the ability to take somebody's life.
I am in favor of the standard, which is it's not me as the citizen layperson trying to judge the officer. It's a reasonable officer standard. And I think that's important because when we're talking about these things, Jeff, I think about myself when I was in my 20s. And how many times do young people, especially young men, go into a bar and get in a fight because somebody looked at them wrong, somebody said something to their girlfriend? It's hard to harness that in at that age with all the testosterone and everything. And I guess just imagine that these police officers, when they go into a crowd and they're faced with the animosity that is now, they got to be juiced up for a lot of reasons. And so I tend to give them a little bit more leeway. And we think about these police officers that, like you say, don't put yourself in front of a vehicle. When I watch some of that film, I want to know the bigger picture. I mean, there's people all over the place there. These officers are going other places too. It's not all about where this one vehicle is, right? It's maybe multiple vehicles, multiple people. I could see making the mistake of going in front of a vehicle as it's starting to accelerate because another police officer is at their door. And So, I would tend to give the officer a break on that mistake. And now you've got whether there was actual fear because this vehicle's coming at them. I kind of think if I put myself in the place of these police officers, I tend to think, wow, what a tough job. Jeff, let me put something out to you. What do you think about a tiered accountability? I raised this with Jack the other day, and I said, sometimes these officers do something that's entirely stupid, but you can kind of understand how they got themselves into that position. They just should no longer be police officers. Put them in a different role somewhere as opposed to putting them in prison for the rest of their life for this mistake. And, our criminal justice system really doesn't have those step downs. It's kind of all or nothing. When these officers are brought up on charges, they're as serious as they are if they weren't a police officer and somebody died. And I just wonder if there could be tiered accountability. What do you think?
Well, actually, John, there really is. First and foremost, the organization holding their people accountable to the standard. And there should be discipline to the point of wanting to change the behavior in the future in the event that they are confronted with a similar circumstance. And it doesn't always have to be negative discipline. It can be positive discipline, where you have a situation where people actually are doing what you're asking them to do, that they're rewarded for it. That needs to be part of the culture of the organization as well.
I think this Blendon Township officer got his job back, though, didn't he?
He did.
And you wonder about that. And was there any discipline? And Jack, you've talked a lot about your after you were on your flights, your missions, having post flight, right?
What Gonzo's referring to is typical. I flew fighters. I was a backseater back in the day. Yes, Gonzo, that was 40 years ago when I had hair. Go ahead, say it.
No, it was with the Wright brothers.
But after every flight, you would debrief the whole flight. You would debrief, especially if you were engaged in simulated aerial combat. You would say, okay, here's what you did. It was very educational. It wasn't, what's the word I'm looking, ego-oriented. It was, how can we get better? So here are the things you did well in terms of maneuvering your jet. And then we had the other column called other. Okay, these were the things that, I don't know what you were thinking, or this was a bad move for these reasons. So we were always debriefing, which, I always valued that because it was, how do we get better? Not how do we praise each other. We don't slam each other. It's how do we help each other get better. It's a very positive atmosphere.
But it's funny that you mentioned that, Jack, because when I was with the LAPD, one of the things that I created was use the model that the Blue Angels use. And what that is every time an officer involved shooting or lethal force incident, in the past, prior to creating this debrief model, we never addressed that incident until up to a year later when the case was adjudicated administratively. Then and only then would we discuss things. But with this debrief model, you're required within 2 weeks to have a debrief of the substantially involved personnel in that incident. And that's anybody that used force or made any significant tactical decisions. And the purpose for it is, first and foremost, like you said, you want to identify the things that you did well. So in a future incident that's similar, you'll emulate that again. But you also want to identify the areas that you can improve upon. And I have never seen one tactical incident that there's not something that you can identify that you can improve upon. And the one thing that the Blue Angels do is the first thing they do is go around the room and you critique yourself. And you have to be willing to do that. And you should be your own worst critic. Because what that does is that builds credibility and trust within your unit, wherein you're saying, I can self-assess and I determine I made this mistake. This is what I'm going to do to fix it, and you can hold me accountable. There's no better way to do this. And unfortunately, in this Blendon Township incident, the chief of police comes out with this public comment that is defending the officer before the investigation has even occurred. You're showing your hand that you're already biased in your interpretation and assessment of what occurred. So that's first and foremost, you're not being honest and transparent about your responsibility to look at this case objectively and without bias in determining whether there's any accountability that needs to be had on the officer's perspective. But what a breakdown of trust that the community is going to have of the law enforcement agency, because it's like, you've already determined, and we're only a day into this. The investigation hasn't even begun. So, those are the problems that we have. And, more than anything, it's tough. We need to bridge this divide that the community has with the police organizations that serve them. There's a lot of trust that's not had, and I understand why.
Regrettably, we saw that on a massive scale with the shooting of Nicole Good. We're not even a couple hours out, and we're hearing from Homeland Security and the president about their side of the story. It's terrible. All right, now let me ask a hard question. First of all, I want to make my position clear by asking this question. I am not suggesting that police not carry guns. Repeat, I am not suggesting that police not carry guns. But I wonder if guns are used, somehow give a police officer an inappropriate, I don't know how to phrase this, cause him to instinctively use the gun more so than necessary. And here's the classic case, I think. It's the Sonia Massey shooting. Are you familiar with that one? So for our listeners, Sonia Massey, deputy sheriffs are called to her apartment. When they enter, she's not completely coherent in terms of her state of mind. That's kind of duplicative. Yeah, she's just not with it. And then she steps behind a counter. She's in her kitchen. The police officers are, I would say, it looks like maybe 15 feet away, Jeff, would you say?
Yeah, approximately, maybe 20.
Okay. And she's cooking, and they're concerned. I can't remember what brought them into her apartment, but they're certainly there. She's got a pot of boiling water. So she's 15 to 20 feet away. She's not coherent. The police officer is telling her to put down the pot of boiling water. She says, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. And maybe she takes a step or two forward. I can't recall. But there's certainly distance and a counter between Sonia and these deputies, and he shoots and kills her. And his defense is, well, she was going to throw hot water at me. Now I'm thinking, the gun is an easy resource to use. You've got this gun, you go to the gun, and I wonder how he would have responded if he only had a baton. I'm wondering if the culture is such that they're spring-loaded to go. Here's what I'm trying to say. If they're not spring-loaded to go to the gun in situations where you would say, what were you thinking? Respond to that. Tell me how wrong I am.
Well, I would say that I would never suggest that law enforcement officers here in the United States should be unarmed. They absolutely have to be armed. We have more guns in this country than we have people. And there's always the potential that an incident could escalate to the point where deadly force would be necessary.
I'm not advocating that.
Right. Well, I understand that.
Okay.
But I have to make it clear that I'm not advocating for that either. So the key here is the threshold or the policy and procedure that we have for the justification to draw your weapon. And one could suggest that that standard is pretty low. And perhaps as law enforcement organizations, we need to better evaluate that in the determining of the appropriateness of that. Because here, if we're going to go back to this Takia Young shooting, we have a misdemeanor, a petty theft, which actually the Kroger, which is the store that it was taken from, it's their policy that they don't want to have criminal charges filed. They just want to get the property back. And it also was a misdemeanor not committed in the presence of the officers. So force used has to be commensurate with the severity of the crime. And placing yourself in front of the vehicle and drawing the gun, and not only just drawing the gun, but on the video, you can see he puts his finger directly on the trigger, which is a complete violation of firearm safety rules. You never put your finger on the trigger until your sights are aligned on target and you intend to shoot. And in evaluating this, was even the choice of stepping in front of the car questionable? Yes, that could be argued. But drawing the gun, was that appropriate? What objective information did you have that led you to believe that this incident could escalate to the point where deadly force would become necessary, other than the fact that you placed yourself in front of the car? Your partner, who was standing at the side driver's window, didn't draw his gun. You make a great point. And it's about what we talked about a little bit ago when John asked me about this contempt of cop mentality. I can't get in any officer's head. I can't tell you what they're thinking. I don't know. But listen, I equate this. I was an elite hockey player. I played Division I collegiate hockey, and if not for some serious injuries, I probably would have had a pretty formidable professional career. That being said, if you're a professional athletic team or professional athlete, you never get to that level if you crumble under stress. You have to be able to keep a clear head and not panic. And that's what we need our officers to be doing. And it's about having confidence in your abilities to handle yourself. And that goes back to the training. I would say oftentimes, the reality is when you go graduate from the academy, you have grappling that you have to show proficiency in, pugilistics, striking, using your baton, all those sorts of things. After that, you get maybe every couple years, you get perishable skills training and grappling where you go for 4 hours. Let me tell you, you're never going to feel comfortable getting on the ground with a suspect when 85% of the time, within the first 30 seconds of a physical altercation, it goes to the ground. If you're not confident in your abilities to handle yourself in that situation or to stand toe-to-toe to somebody and get involved in a Donnybrook, then you're going to be more inclined to go to the gun. So it speaks back to our training. How confident are our officers in their abilities to handle these cases and incidents and circumstances when they are escalating without having to go to their gun? Because once you go to your gun, it's hard to go back.
It's interesting. You've spoken about something that I should have been sensitive to, and I would suspect the public is not, and that is all the training that it takes to instill the right kind of judgment in difficult situations. And I suspect, I can't say this based on empirical evidence, I suspect that's just not part of the training. Because if it were, it would take some large number of hours to get to where you want to be.
Yep. Well, the one thing I will tell you, there is empirical evidence on something, and that is education.
Oh, well, sure.
If you have a 4-year degree or higher and you're a police officer, you have 40% less incidents of force and 40% less incidents of personnel complaints. So LAPD, where I came from, the educational standard for hiring is a GED. Is that a problem? Yes. Why are we not requiring some level of education? Or like the Nordic countries, building it into the training after you become hired? Because I'm not suggesting that somebody that comes out of the military that doesn't have a 4-year degree shouldn't be a police officer. That's not what I'm saying. But we should build it into the training. They're just going to be that much better of a police officer because it's your ability to evaluate a circumstance, use critical thinking, and use good judgment in how best to de-escalate a situation where you're going to have an optimal outcome rather than resorting to the traditional hypervigilance of using force. And that the data is there.
Let me pause both of you for a minute. I got a question for Jeff. Are the incidents still fairly rare when we think about what I would think are millions of encounters between law enforcement and citizens? And we have these, and listen, they're tragic because of the nature of what we're talking about, but they seem to me to still be fairly rare for us to say that all of the training is bad. We must be doing something right because, these incidents aren't that prevalent. Or am I wrong? Is it a real problem throughout the country?
I would suggest it is a problem because it's not about the frequency in which they occur. It's the fact that they do occur at all.
Well, let me go back to your analogy about athletes and we just saw it in the Super Bowl. Stephon Diggs and the defender got into a slapping punching match, after a play. Now, these are guys that are trained, they're under stress, they're incredible athletes, yet it gets the better of them. And I just think that you're not going to completely take that out of human nature. It's going to be a part of it no matter how educated, how much training we have. And I'm not suggesting, and I agree with you, Jeff, that we need all of that because the goal should be to eliminate it. But I don't know. I mean, human nature being what it is, you're going to have these people that just in the moment make the ultimate mistake that costs somebody their life. And I guess I just still feel for that person because you see it all the time in all walks of life. Let me ask you a question though. The more this comes up and the more we talk about it, is there a danger in your mind that officers will hesitate when they shouldn't because of it and either put themselves at risk or fellow officers or other citizens? Is that a concern at all?
I don't believe so, no. And I'll qualify that through the fact that we now have body-worn video that is capturing everything, and that hasn't deterred people from doing what they're doing. So I don't believe this will. Police officers should want to be held accountable. If you want to be the best that you can be and perform at your highest level, you want to be held accountable. You want to have clear expectations, and you want to have systems in place that recognize when you adhere to those standards, and then also hold you accountable when you are deficient in them. And that's only the way that you're going to have professionalism. And I don't buy this. I want to give them a pass or an excuse. Listen, police officers in Graham versus Connor does not require that the police officer be right in their observations. You can have what they call perception shootings, where you believe that you saw the gun, but it turns out it wasn't a gun, or you misperceive the movement or what have you. That can still be objectively reasonable and completely appropriate. But we're talking about these cases that I don't categorize them as rapidly unfolding tactical scenarios wherein you are in a split-second decision. A lot of these ones that we're talking about when it involves the vehicles are created many moments before the shooting actually occurs. And there's nothing rapidly unfolding that justifies, in my mind, you deviating from a critical standard in training practice that you're exposed to and that you should be held to adhere to. So I don't know, and I have this position because you're never going to have law enforcement be a profession. It's just going to be a vocation if we don't have this accountability. And I'm not saying it needs to be at the criminal level. I agree with you, John. There should be a tiered level. The organization should hold people accountable. I saw with the LAPD when it came to shooting at or from moving vehicles, you shall not do it. That a moving vehicle in and of itself is not presumptively a lethal threat against you, except in the most extreme circumstances. You are not to put yourself in that position. And if you do, you're to get out of the way. And it's that simple. And you hold them accountable to that. And you find it administratively disapproved or out of policy shooting. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be held accountable criminally, but you're going to be held accountable relative to administratively.
Very similar situation that is the high-speed chases. I mean, they pretty much, because of all the litigation over it, and I've sued civilly over that, they shut that kind of thing down. You just don't engage in high-speed chases. They were too dangerous to the public. But, yeah, I think that's another example. One of the things that I think about is this transparency. Whatever the standards are, I think our government, especially thinking about Minnesota and what's going on there, should come out and say, first of all, we can all agree that an American citizen dying at the hands of law enforcement is not a good thing. And they ought to just have paused right there and said, we are going to get to the bottom of it. Maybe the officer did what they were trained to do. Maybe they didn't. But we need to get to the bottom of it. And I just don't understand the current administration's doubling down on something without any facts. And like Jeff said, with a lot of these officers, the police chiefs and their bosses will come out and say, yeah, they didn't do anything wrong. And we haven't even had an investigation.
That's a whole nother subject, Gonz.
Well, it is, but it isn't, because, you and I look at these cases and we get some of the facts, and the ones that work their way through the criminal justice system, we get more facts to base our thoughts on. But really, that's somehow where this discussion has to go, that we all agree it's not a good thing. We should be transparent. It should be investigated. And then people held accountable if that's where the investigation leads. Why can't we make it that simple?
Because of the human condition.
Maybe. I go back to one of my favorite movies, Paul Blart, Mall Cop.
What was it?
Paul Blart, Mall Cop. Oh, you got to watch it if you haven't. But he doesn't have a gun. He's just a cop in the mall. And he says, your voice is a powerful weapon. Anyway, Jeff, hey, we really appreciate you coming on. I would like to talk to you more about it. It sounds like you've got the kind of standards that we wish all law enforcement people did, and we appreciate you giving us the benefit of your knowledge.
I appreciate you having me on. It was a good conversation.
It was a great conversation, and I would distill everything you said, if I had to one word. And I think it would be accountability. And I like what you said. Accountability is what creates professionalism. And that's what gets lost. So thank you. Our thanks to WOSU and our sound engineer, Dalton Jones. If you like what you've heard today, tell a friend. We want this to be more than just us. We want it to be all of us. Follow us on your favorite podcast, submit a review, help elevate our profile so that other podcast listeners can find us. We'll be back in another week or so with another social justice issue. Until then, so long.